All right, do this thing. So I'll start doing these silence those notifications real quick. All right, turn. Okay, I think it worked that time. So I'm going to be doing a textual critique, starting with this 12 by 12, which is a 12 steps and 12 traditions publication from Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll also be doing other books, but I want to start with this one because it's something I'm knee deep in. And it's something they explicitly tell you not to do within the text. But if my time in practicing skepticism has taught me anything, it's that especially, if not always, question authority, but especially if you're told not to question it, then that's what you should do, right? If you're explicitly told not to question a particular doctrine or philosophy, you should be especially critical of that doctrine or philosophy, right? So it makes sense. All right, so it's going to be a shorter one, but we'll just run through the text. And as we read, I will introduce my criticism of the work, and I will also introduce praise whenever I feel praise is due. So, step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one, of course. Every natural instinct cries out against the idea of personal powerlessness. It is truly awful to admit that, glass in hand, we have warped our minds into such an obsession for destructive drinking that only an act of Providence can remove it from us. All right, so in this first paragraph, um, right, the step is we admit we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, they'll talk more about this later on, but there are certain people who kind of acknowledge this step um, without having actually experienced this. An unmanageability in their lives. Alcohol doesn't necessarily, and alcoholism and addiction doesn't necessarily cause the same consequences for everybody universally, right? So later on, they'll say that, initially the program deals with what they call low bottom drunks, people who have lost their homes, their jobs, their families, right? But what they hope to achieve is to um, kind of nip this problem in the bud, right? To get the alcoholic away from alcohol before it destroys their livelihood. Now, there's a secondary concept in here, which I think it goes to in this passage, which is personal powerlessness, right? Because it takes a certain degree, and they say this too, of willingness, right? The individual must be willing to seek help and to take the step necessary in order to break these harmful habituations, right? Which is an act of personal volition. And yet, in order to take the step towards volition, you must claim that you are powerless, right? That's an act of contradiction. If you have no power over it, then you could never take this step to retain power over your life, right? But you have to live with this contradiction in order to work within the confines of this program. Okay. To anybody who is, kind of thinking critically about any of this, right? It's going to be immediately obvious that you have at least the power to uh, enter a program and to work a certain number of steps in order to achieve a state of being empowered against alcoholic drinking and thinking. But this claim at the end, only an act of providence can remove it from us. What is providence? And this basically all the language in this, even though they say it is a non-religious program, refers back to Christian methodologies, right? Christian ideologies. They say, well, if you're not Christian, that's fine. You can have your own concept of God, but you still have to work within this framework of miracles and acts of providence, which is drawn strictly from the Christian framework. Okay, in the next paragraph it says, no other kind of bankruptcy is like this one. Alcohol now become the rapacious creditor, bleeds us of all self-sufficiency and all will to resist its demands. Once this stark fact is accepted, our bankruptcy as going human concerns is complete. No other kind of bankruptcy is like this one. And what they mean by this is it is, in a sense, the removal of your volition, right? Your will, your power over alcohol, the choice whether to drink or not to drink, when to drink or not to drink, has been removed from you. The alcohol itself, right, or addiction, whether it be drugs, alcohol, sex, is a form of spiritual bankruptcy. They don't use the word spiritual here, but that's what they mean. And that your will has been diminished. Bleeds us of all self-sufficiency and the will to resist its demands. Now, again, when they say self-sufficiency, this isn't necessarily universally true. And it may be that a person still retains some semblance of self-control. And so you must, again, still have some semblance of this self-control in order to continue functioning. Okay, the next passage. But upon entering AA, we soon take quite another view of this absolute humiliation. We perceive that only through utter defeat are we able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. Our admissions of personal powerlessness finally turn out to be firm bedrock upon which happy and purposeful lives may be built. Now, what they mean by this, right, is not strictly the overtaking of the will, right? What they're talking about is humility, and they confuse humility with humiliation here, right? But the statement that I'm powerless over substance can be quite humiliating to somebody. It can, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it can supplant the ego. That's a good enough word. However, to somebody who is still quite aware, right, of the power of their own will and volition, regardless of this circumstance, right? You're going to see this as merely an impediment. We perceive that only through utter defeat we are able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. This is what they call rock bottom, right? They say that people have to achieve rock bottom, and by that, they oftentimes mean low bottom, essentially to where you have nothing left to lose. This can be counterproductive. Many people with nothing left to lose will find that an excuse to be more self-destructive. If you already taken everything from me, right? What else is there? And the only thing left is the will, is the volition. Once again, it's contradictory. However, using this ideology, using this methodology, it is presumed that if the only thing left is your volition, that you will use that volition, that power to will, or will to power, in order to take to take certain steps in order to make a positive change in your life. In this case, would be the removal of those substances. All right, continued. We know that little good can come to any alcoholic who joins AA unless he has first accepted his devastating weakness and all its consequences. Until he so humbles himself, his sobriety, if any, will be precarious. Or of real happiness he will find none at all. And they call this, I'm going to stop there mid-paragraph, they call this being dry rather than sober. If you remove alcohol or substances, or whatever your addiction of choice is, and you don't take other steps to improve your way of thinking, right, you will still be unhappy. And you'll still have the same negative consequences in your life, right? Because it's not just about removing a substance, it's also about taking steps to make other positive changes in one's life. Now, this is kind of a point of conflict here, because AA is said not to be a self-help group, right? It is a peer support group for people who are addressing a particular issue, which is substance abuse, alcohol abuse particularly, and then others as you go into NA and other anonymous programs. But along with that, accompanying that, once you remove the substance, then you have to take certain other steps in order to actually improve yourself. And the idea here is that you cannot improve yourself unless you remove the impediment of the substance or activity, the addictive behavior of choice, right? That's really your downfall. But it only underlies a multitude of other shortcomings that must be overcome. Continue. Proved beyond doubt by an immense experience. This is one of the facts of AA life. So purely anecdotal. And much of what is said in these books is purely anecdotal. After the main course of the text in the big book, in the AA big book, you say, okay, these are the guidelines, these are the testimonies of the founders and all of their research, and here's kind of our framework for how you proceed, right? And then there is a long list in the back of personal experiences, anecdotes, which they then use as evidence for the efficacy of this program. All right, continue. The principle that we shall find no enduring strength until we first admit complete defeat is the main taproot from which our whole society has sprung and flowered. So in other words, for the people who have attended this program and who base their lives around this system and attest to the efficacy of this program, for all of them, according to this, they must have first admitted complete defeat. But they were completely powerless, they were unable to manage their own lives, and they had no willpower strong enough with which to resist the temptation of alcohol. Which is not necessarily true, because you do see stories in this where people do resist the alcohol, sometimes for many years, right? And again, they persist that they are dry at that point because they're not they're not taking other steps towards personal progress. And I think this is a big point to make, because this focuses merely on removing addictive substances. It doesn't focus on improving oneself and one's station in one's life, right? Which is really the underpinning. That's the thing that perpetuates the cycle of addiction, right? Is that people aren't taking the necessary steps forward in life. They're not achieving a certain level of maturation, and they're not essentially getting what they want out of life, right? Their needs, their goals aren't being fulfilled. All right, continued. When first challenged to admit defeat, most of us revolted. We had approached AA expecting to be taught self-confidence. Then we had been told that so far as alcohol is concerned, self-confidence is no good whatever. In fact, it was a total liability. And in this, I stop again, mid-paragraph, there is a concept, an idea that says that if we believe at some point that we have achieved a power over the substance of choice, right? Power over alcohol, drugs, addictive behaviors, that we will fall back into those patterns of behavior, right? And so any self-confidence, any degree of confidence in your ability to withstand against said substance, right, becomes a liability because it will inevitably fall you back into the same trap. We continue. Our sponsors declared that we were the victims of a mental obsession so subtly powerful that no amount of human willpower could break it. There was, they said, no such thing as the personal conquest of this compulsion by the unaided will. Relentlessly deepening our dilemma, our sponsors pointed out our increasing sensitivity to alcohol, an allergy, they called it. The tyrant alcohol wielded a double-edged sword over us. First, we were smitten by an insane urge that condemned us to go on drinking, and then by an allergy of the body that ensured we would ultimately destroy ourselves in the process. Few indeed were those who, so assailed, had ever won through in single-handed combat. It was a statistical fact that alcoholics almost never recovered on their own resources, and this had been true apparently ever since man had first crushed grapes. So it is true that the majority of people who overcome the tendency towards addiction and alcoholism, who do not enter a program, are never counted amongst the number of people who recover. Now, there are other conflicting texts, right, that you could find in things like cognitive behavioral therapy based programs. They'll say, well, actually, there's probably a much larger number of people who do recover without ever going through these programs, but they would never be counted. They'd never be documented. So they can only go by the number of people who self-report to AA and to substance abuse counselors, right? Those are the numbers they're going by. Another thing is that they say that you have an increasing sensitivity to alcohol. Now, what's interesting is that because the nature of this program is to say, oh, well, you need to be sober, such an amount of time, right? So that if um, you're rewarded for your time within the program. Um, so if you make it 30 days without alcohol, you get a chip, say, and there's accolades, applause, right? And then if you go back to drinking, right, and now your tolerance has decreased, they call it an increased sensitivity or an increasing sensitivity, right? But that's the nature of the beast you're dealing with. Your tolerance, your threshold is lowered, and your mentality tells you that you can drink the same or possibly even more than you used to, and of course, you're less tolerant to that substance. Um, so, and when they call it an allergy, I know people have addressed this before. There is no, I mean, well, okay, technically everyone's allergic to alcohol, right? Putting alcohol into your system is a means of poisoning oneself. That is why it has intoxicating effects. But the allergy that they're speaking of, right, is and mental obsession is the other part, and that's the true part. When we become fixated on achieving a particular state of mind, um, and so become obsessed with using that substance to achieve that state of mind and trying to re-enter a certain framework, a certain state of feeling. Right, that is what the alcoholic addict is going for. They want to try to control the way they feel by introducing this substance, right? That has hopefully, presumably, a predictive effect or predictable effect, I should say. Okay, continued. In AA's pioneering time, none but the most desperate cases could swallow and digest this unpalatable truth. Even these last gaspers often had difficulty in realizing how hopeless they actually were. But a few did, and when these laid hold of AA principles with all the fervor with which the drowning seize life preservers, they almost invariably got well. So, and again, what they mean by this is people who have absolutely nothing. Um, they feel that alcohol is destroying their lives, it is killing them, and they're going to die without this. And generally, these are the same people who feel they're going to die in the absence of alcohol. Now, from experience, I can attest that this is true, right? You can get sufficiently inundated to achieve a state where you feel as if without the next drink, uh, your whole world is going to implode. You're going to die without it. There is a physical component to this, right? Because there is a physical component to addiction. But much of this is mental. And it's about breaking the mental chains of habituation, right? Which is one of the reasons that regular attendance in AA is so effective, right? Because you habituate yourself to being around a group of people who are remaining sober and talking about remaining sober rather than uh, isolating, which is very common, or being around a group of people whose prerogative is to become intoxicated and enjoy that state of intoxication. This is one of the things that I appreciate about the program is because anytime I am in a room with those people, I um, am impressed by the fact that I am in a group of people that is taking life seriously that there's not a lot of joking around, and there are people with real goals who are intent on attaining those ends, right? And it's not about having a good time. It's not about trying to feel good and do something pleasurable, right? It's being in an uncomfortable situation, trying to attain a realistic goal, and talking about realistic ways to move towards that goal. And so they're taking life seriously. All right, we continue. That is why the first edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, published when our membership was small, dealt with low-bottom cases only. Many less desperate alcoholics tried AA, but did not succeed because they could not make the admission of hopelessness. And right here, again, I find fault with this terminology: hopelessness, powerlessness. If you have no hope, then there's no point in going to a program, right? If you have no power, then you would never make it to a program, right? They try to take it to these extremes to get at the person emotionally. I want to say you have no other hope other than this. You have no power. Only this can save you. And it's quite religious, right? This is, like the Christians saying that you are just a hopeless sinner, right? Only Jesus can save you, nothing else, because you were born a sinner. And Alcoholics Anonymous says only the program can save you because you were born an alcoholic, right? But this is untrue. This is just emotional pleading. We continue. It is a tremendous satisfaction to record that in the following years this changed. Alcoholics who still had their health, their families, their jobs, and even 2 cars in the garage began to recognize their alcoholism. As this trend grew, they were joined by young people who were scared more than potential alcoholics. I'll stop there. I think this is interesting, and it's kind of counterintuitive to say that we will convince people that they are potential alcoholics or addicts before they become alcoholics or addicts, right? To stop them. But in the framework, right, the first step is to admit that you're powerless over alcohol and your life has become unmanageable. Yet if neither of those two things tends to be true, right, you are creating an alcoholic where one did not exist. You're telling a person who is, in fact, managing their own lives perfectly well that their drinking would inevitably become a problem if they do not adhere to your program. And again, this is much like religiosity. Well, you may not be a sinner now, but if you don't come to Jesus, you will be damned. Continued. They were spared that last 10 or 15 years of literal hell the rest of us had gone through. Since step 1 requires an admission that our lives have become unmanageable, how could people such as these take this step? Good question. And, they say the last 10 or 15 years of literal hell, were you literally on fire? What was the literal hell? No. Okay. But let's continue with the question. What is the question? How could people such as these take this step? It was obviously necessary to raise the bottom the rest of us had hit to the point where it would hit them. By going back in our own drinking histories, we could show that years before we realized it, we were out of control, that our drinking even then was no mere habit, that it was indeed the beginning of a fatal progression, which is, right, untrue. And I have this issue with this. If it had been fatal, you wouldn't be here to talk about it, right? You'd be dead, obviously, by definition, literally. Okay. and they say, well, if I don't quit drinking, I'm going to die. You're going to die anyway. Everybody's going to die. Do you mean you're going to die sooner than you otherwise would have? Do you mean you're going to die a more horrible death? Right? No mere habit. Well, that is what alcoholism is. It's habituation of a regular drinking pattern. It doesn't necessarily apply to one pattern of drinking. You have the daily drunk, right? The maintenance drunk who's drinking all day, every day. You have the daily drunk who's drinking every day, but only after work, right? You have periodic drunks, people who are maybe only drinking on the weekends, yet still might be considered alcoholics, right? So there is no strict rule of adherence to one type of habituation. It's only that anytime becoming intoxicated becomes a habituation, which you have no control to stop, right? And they call it a fatal progression. Life is a fatal progression. What do you mean? What is the expectation of the outcome here? Do people have realistic expectations? Do you want to extend your life expectancy by 10 or 15 years? So, yeah, I take some issues with that. And they're drawing parallels to their own lives in the time before they had joined a program. And applying it to these young people, having these young people apply it to their own circumstance. And it's easy to see how one could end up in the same predicament, right? But one might not necessarily end up in the same predicament. All right, we continue. To the doubters, we could say, perhaps you're not an alcoholic after all. Why don't you try some more controlled drinking? Bearing in mind, meanwhile, what we have told about alcoholism. Well, there's two schools of thought in this, right? Because on the one hand, it does say in the big book that if you are an alcoholic, then one is too many and 1,000 is never enough. And essentially, if you begin drinking, right now, you will not stop drinking. You have no power not to drink the next drink. So if, right, you have this drink, and then you say, I won't have another drink for another 24 hours. Well, you may have passed the test according to some criterion that says, hey, well, I drank today, and, I may drink tomorrow. But as long as you don't just continue, right? But then the next set of criterion says, well, no, because then if you drink again tomorrow, you're still fulfilling the second part of that. You're not strictly in control. And it's like, well, where does that end? They say, oh, I'll have a drink today, and then I won't have another drink until a month from now. Oh, I'll have a drink today, and I won't have another drink until a year from now. But there's no criterion for that, right? It's up to each individual to decide how much is enough for them and then stick to that limit, right? So if you take the advice of the next person, which says, why don't you try some controlled drinking? That control is dependent upon your own criterion for what your limit is and what your self-control should be, if that makes any sense. Okay. Continued. This attitude brought immediate and practical results. It was then discovered that when one alcoholic had planted in the mind of another the true nature of his malady, that person could never be the same again. Following every spree, he would say to himself, maybe those AAs were right. After a few such experiences, often years before the onset of extreme difficulties, he would return to us convinced he had hit bottom as truly as any of us. John Barleycorn himself had become our best advocate, being a metaphor for alcohol, in the personification of alcohol, apparently. But he hadn't hit bottom, right? Like at this point, he's had an idea planted in his head that he cannot stop drinking. And so if he drinks and he ever drinks again and feels a sense of failure around that particular bout with drinking, then that could be his own personal bottom. But that is a mental state, right? It's only through very specific physical experiences, right? Whether you get wet brain, liver or kidney failure, things like these, if you have physical reasons, right, that you can no longer drink, then you accept that, right? But if it's you versus your own mind, and you say, well, I'm not going to have a drink until tomorrow, and then you have a second drink 4 hours later, right? That is you wrestling with your own conscience. And then having to face other people who've told you this was the case. So there's a social element in there. If one is not sufficiently self-reliant, then the social element um, is going to insinuate itself into the thought process, right? You're going to become self-conscious about the act of drinking, whether or not it is detrimental to you as an individual. All right, we continue. Why all this insistence that every AA must hit bottom first? The answer is that few people will sincerely try to practice the AA program unless they have hit bottom, right? So they have to believe there is no other way, there is no hope, and this is the only thing that they can do to save them from destruction. So if you are not faced with this actual dilemma of being legitimately destroyed by addiction or alcoholism, you have to have the mentality that says that that is the case, right? You must believe it first. Seems to be an issue. You believe it whether it's true or not. Do you have sufficient evidence to believe it? Or have you merely been persuaded by emotional arguments? Continued. For practicing AA's remaining 11 steps means the adoption of attitudes and actions that almost no alcoholic who is still drinking can dream of taking. Who wishes to be rigorously honest and tolerant? Who wants to confess his faults to another and make restitution for harm done? And I would insert here, there are certainly people, and you know, this is just a broad generalization I cannot agree with. It says that all people who drink and use are incapable of being rigorously honest and tolerant, of wanting to confess their faults to another and make restitution for harm they have done. Right? Certainly, there are a lot of cases in which one would not wish to be honest. One is incapable of being tolerant, but that doesn't mean that they don't wish to do so. Right? It's an incapacity to carry out those virtues. Right? Um, Confession of faults and restitution for harm. Again, I mean, I would say there are many people in active addiction who still try to do this. Maybe ineffectively, but they may want those things. All right. Continued. Who cares anything about a higher power, let alone meditation and prayer? Once again, this is presumptuous. People who drink and use may be believers. Many of them are, and they're going to talk about this later. In step 2, they're going to talk more about the God concept, right? But there are many believers who, nonetheless, are struggle with addiction and addictive behavior. And they pray probably on a regular basis. Meditation, maybe with more or less, varying degrees of success. Meditation is hard to carry out with a sober mind. It must be that much harder to do if one is intoxicated. It's not to say that they don't care about doing it or they don't make some attempts to do so. So this is just a bad assumption. Continued. Who wants to sacrifice time and energy in trying to carry AA's message to the next sufferer? Now that, arguably, you'd have to believe, again, in the efficacy of the program. You'd have to be fully convinced that this program had worked in order to carry it to another person. So, yeah, I wouldn't say if one's not fully convinced that they're alcoholic and that this program cures alcoholism or treats alcoholism, because there is no cure for alcoholism according to them, then why would you want to spread the message, right? Much the same as the religious undertone. If you didn't believe in the gospel, why would you want to spread the gospel? In this case, right, because religion tells you you must spread the gospels, and people are compelled to say that they believe, right? In AA, people are not compelled to say they believe. They have to come to a personal, a state of their own personal mentality being shifted for them to truly adhere to belief and then want to truly carry the message to the next person. Continued. No, the average alcoholic, self-centered in the extreme, doesn't care for this prospect, unless he has to do these things in order to stay alive himself. Now, this is one thing that I disagree with in all aspects of when they talk about addicts and alcoholics being self-centered, self-serving, self-seeking, right? But you will hear many people who specifically say that they use drugs and alcohol as a means to escape themselves. They want to escape their own situation. They want to escape their own thoughts. It is escapism. Now, in a sense, this is self-seeking, right? Because it is pleasurable. It's hedonistic, right? But in another sense, this is the ultimate escape from self. Cannot be self-centered, right? It is the neglect of self. All right. And the last paragraph here. Under the lash of alcoholism, we are driven to AA, and there we discover the fatal nature of our situation. Then and only then do we become as open-minded to conviction and as willing to listen as the dying can be. We stand ready to do anything which will lift the merciless obsession from us. Now, that's kind of the crux of it. You have to be ready to do anything, because you will die. Right? Wouldn't you do anything we tell you in order to save your own life? And certainly, if one believes they are caught in the trap of a fatal progressive disease, why wouldn't they do anything, right? If the doctor tells you, stop eating today or you're going to die in, 6 months, you might take that advice. However, lacking any empirical evidence, they just say, well, stop eating meat today or you're going to die one day. A reasonable person would say, well, I'm going to die one day anyway. Can you be more specific? Right? The consequence has to be more immediate, and the diagnosis has to be more certain. And so this is problematic. We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. If you're truly powerless over alcohol, then you would never stop drinking. Even with the aid of a program and a peer support group, it wouldn't make any sense. All right, that's my first thoughts on this, and I'll be back with more another time.